From the observation decks of the Xarthan Imperial Spire, the stars seemed to bow to her presence before she even stepped onto the palace floor. We watched, as alien chroniclers always do, not merely seeing but feeling the dissonance she carried, a mortal frame commanding a gravity no technology or throne could bestow. The corridors, lined with pulsating obsidian panels and the cold hum of anti-gravity conduits, seemed to lean toward her as if acknowledging something ancient, something the galaxy had long tried to ignore. Her steps were deliberate, measured, a rhythm that resonated through the polished floors and into our distant orbits. We sensed it immediately, a presence so subtle yet undeniable that it tugged at the edges of perception. The council members, draped in ceremonial silks dyed from crushed stellar flora, whispered among themselves. Arrogance tinted their tone, disbelief curling through their language. "A single human. Into the heart of our empire?" one murmured. Another laughed nervously. Yet their laughter faltered under the weight of something unseen. The Grand Galactic King, seated upon a throne carved from black starstone, eyes narrowed into slits of calculated menace. Even from our detached stations, we felt his tension, the tightening of muscles that had never trembled before. His mind, clouded by centuries of conquest, already plotted her demise, believing he could extinguish the spark before it became a blaze. But we, observers from far-flung orbits, knew better. That spark was no ordinary fire. Something ancient stirred within her, latent, precise, terrifyingly deliberate. The Hall of Thrones opened before her, a vast chamber of reflective surfaces and hovering holographic emblems. Light fractured against polished pillars, yet even the fractured glow seemed to bend subtly around her, yielding to her passage. The air vibrated, not with sound, but with expectation, with the subtle electricity of inevitability. Council members leaned forward, some curious, others wary, but all unable to tear their gaze from the anomaly she represented. She paused only once, at the center of the hall, and we saw it. The calm that belied chaos, the assurance of one who had walked through storms and emerged unbroken. The king's hand twitched, imperceptibly at first, then more insistently. Assassins in ceremonial garb, poised like statues, shifted in synchronized readiness. All of them underestimated her. All of them assumed fragility, yet from where we observed, the galaxy itself seemed to pause, holding its breath as if recognizing that history, real, irrevocable, unimaginable, was about to be rewritten. A storm was approaching, though it had yet to make itself visible, and in that pause we realized something both thrilling and terrifying. The Terran Diplomat was no envoy. She was the herald of forces far beyond the Council's comprehension. The king's eyes narrowed further, a silent warning. But she moved forward, her gaze unwavering, as if already seeing beyond the traps, beyond the blades, beyond the arrogance of an empire that thought it controlled everything. And in that moment, we, the distant watchers, alien and accustomed to galactic arrogance, understood a simple, terrifying truth. The game had already shifted. Something was coming, something the galaxy had never seen. And then, with a single step, she crossed the threshold into the Hall of Thrones. The council stirred. The king's hand poised, and we, watching, waiting, knew the first move had been made. Even before the Grand Galactic King could make a move, the council chambers whispered. Voices, usually precise and measured, now trembled with unease. The air itself seemed heavier, laden with anticipation, as if the palace recognized a fracture in reality that mere mortals could not perceive. From our distant observatories, we watched the subtle shifts, the elongation of shadows along the obsidian floors, the flicker of light across crystal-encrusted walls, the faint tremor in the currents of circulating air. Time itself seemed hesitant, pausing for mere fractions of a heartbeat when her presence passed. And the chamber, despite its vast expanse, felt suddenly claustrophobic. Ancient advisors leaned forward, whispering tales long buried. Terran legends, dismissed by most as myth, crept into memory. They spoke of Baba Yaga, a mortal whose wrath could unmake worlds, whose cunning could unravel empires. Even now, centuries later, the warnings echoed. Underestimate her, and you invite annihilation. Their words, hushed but urgent, threaded through the chamber like a dark melody, tugging at nerves that even seasoned counselors could not still. The king's pride blinded him. His gaze swept over the hall with measured arrogance, interpreting the murmurs as fear of audacity, not fear of truth. But we observed the subtle cracks in perception. The council's unity, usually seamless, began to fray. Eyes flicked toward her, then away. Fingers hovered over ceremonial controls, hesitant. Whispered glances exchanged between the most stalwart generals betrayed instinctive recognition. This was no ordinary envoy. Every gesture of hers, tilted head, measured step, slight flex of her hand, radiated confidence and quiet menace. A human storm contained in flesh. We, alien observers, could sense it as clearly as if the signals were encoded in the light itself. The galaxy was bracing. Something unprecedented was approaching. The courtiers who had once believed in the permanence of empire now doubted the reality of their own authority. And the king, blind to the omens, prepared to strike, unaware that each breath, each decision, brought him closer to forces that would not be restrained by crowns, armies, or diplomacy. The murmurs grew, a symphony of unease, as the Terran's calm gaze swept across the council. And then a sudden ripple passed through the chamber. A shadow moved independently of any light, a sound bent in midair, a sense of inevitability pressing upon every counselor. The advisors stiffened, eyes wide, realizing too late that what they faced was no ordinary mortal envoy. And in that pause, that heartbeat suspended between fear and revelation, the first threads of dread wove through the council. The storm had begun. Beneath the throne, in the shadowed catacombs where the stone walls drank the light, the Grand Galactic King convened his most feared assassins. Their blades gleamed coldly, forged from meteorite iron and sharpened to the edge of inevitability, reflecting the artificial starlight in 1,000 fractured sparks. They were perfection incarnate, trained for centuries to strike without hesitation, to extinguish life before thought could form. And yet, even among them, a tremor passed silently. The king's hand, pale and adorned with the insignias of 1,000 conquered worlds, hovered over the ceremonial signal. He did not see what we, distant observers, unblinking, unbound by pride, sensed immediately. Something about her presence was wrong. Not wrong in form, not wrong in motion, but wrong in the very weave of reality. A subtle distortion clung to her aura, bending perception like light through a prism too dense to pierce. The air trembled when she passed. Corridors that had never changed in centuries seemed to breathe, stretch, and coil in anticipation. The assassins, hardened by eons of conquest, began to hesitate. One adjusted a gauntleted hand on a blade, then withdrew it as if an unseen hand had pressed upon their mind. Another's breath caught, small and imperceptible, yet we saw it, noted it. Their discipline, absolute until this moment, faltered under a presence they could neither name nor predict. The king, blinded by hubris, assumed cunning would suffice. Yet his plan, immaculate on paper, frayed immediately when the first strike was launched. Silent as shadows, the killers advanced through the corridors, but the Terran did not merely evade. She anticipated. Every move countered, every angle nullified. Her calm, measured response was not skill alone, it was declaration. The floor, the walls, even the very currents of air seemed to bend subtly around her, redirecting danger, dissipating lethal intent with a grace that mocked mortal assumptions. We watched, alien chroniclers recording the impossible as a human. Fragile, unassuming, bent the deadly precision of trained assassins to futility. This was no diplomat. This was something older, something precise and deliberate. The king's gamble had failed before it began, and the palace, long a fortress of predictable death, had become a theater of uncertainty. And in that corridor of shadows and mirrored steel, the first threads of inevitable revelation stretched taut. The Terran was more than a mortal envoy. She was the storm itself, waiting to descend. The first strike against her had not merely failed, it had unraveled the expected order of the palace itself. The corridors, long practiced pathways of death and control, began to ripple like liquid shadow. Walls stretched, bending subtly as though the stone itself were breathing. Floors shimmered beneath weightless footsteps, shifting imperceptibly, redirecting motion, destabilizing even the most disciplined assassin. The air carried an electric hum, so faint it could have been mistaken for machinery, but we distant observers knew better. Something otherworldly had entered the palace, and the building itself had acknowledged it. The assassins faltered. Their eyes, trained to read every twitch of muscle, every flicker of intent, betrayed confusion. They moved through corridors that should have been predictable, but each step seemed guided by forces beyond their understanding. Time itself hesitated in the moments she passed, and probabilities bent subtly around her presence. She did not raise a weapon, nor strike with mechanical precision. Instead, she manipulated the environment with intention, directing every lethal possibility into harmless channels. A blade whistled past only to strike a shadow. A trap door yawned, then quietly resealed itself before it could claim a life. Every motion was calculated, elegant, terrifying. From our vantage in distant orbits, we observed the Council's horror. Their meticulously crafted plans dissolved like sand under the tide. Advisors clutched ceremonial controls, generals muttered incantations of contingency, and yet nothing altered the inevitable. The Terran moved as though the palace itself were an extension of her will. Every corner she entered became a stage, every shadow a weapon she wielded with precision. Myth had become tangible. Legend had taken flesh. Even we, chroniclers of centuries of war and conquest, felt awe and unease mingle in our perception. This was no diplomat. This was not a negotiator. She was the embodiment of Baba Yaga. The harbinger whispered in Terran tales, a storm clothed in flesh, a force that redefined possibility itself. And as the shadows twisted in unnatural choreography around her, the king's voice echoed faintly from the throne. Contain her, before it is too late. But the air trembled with the silent truth. Containment was no longer possible. The Grand Galactic King rose from his obsidian throne, ceremonial armor gleaming like captured light from dying stars. The chamber's ambient glow reflected off his polished plates, fragments of starlight scattering across the pillars. Confidence radiated from him, a confidence born of centuries of unchallenged power, of empires that bent to his will without question. He stepped forward, intending to impose authority with presence alone, to silence the anomaly with a display of raw dominance. Yet the Terran did not flinch. Her gaze, calm and unwavering, met his with a weight that unsettled even the most ancient observers. We, watching from distant orbits, sensed the unspoken history within her eyes, centuries of experience compressed into one mortal frame. Her lips parted only once, uttering words measured and deliberate, each syllable a quiet assertion of inevitability. She did not raise weapons. She did not flee. She merely stood, a pivot around which chaos would soon revolve. The king's strike came next, swift and precise, a dance of lethal elegance meant to crush resistance instantly. Yet she countered without effort, without violence, using movement that seemed to preempt his intentions. Shadows along the walls shifted unnaturally, coiling like serpents, responding as if alive, obeying commands we could only perceive as instinctive extensions of her will. Each motion redirected energy, each stance recalculated probability, and the king found himself confronted not by a human, but by the battlefield itself bending against him. The council gasped, alien chroniclers frozen in awe and horror. Here was a being who transformed environment into weapon, presence into strategy. Each gesture was a declaration. She was not a diplomat, not a negotiator. She was the embodiment of something older, something elemental, a human storm whose reach extended beyond comprehension. The king's eyes flickered with disbelief. His armor meant to intimidate seemed fragile now, reflecting the futility of control. The confrontation did not end in death, but in revelation. The council witnessed the shattering of assumptions. Humans, small, frail, and underestimated, could wield power no empire could contain, And as the Terran shifted her stance, ready for what none yet understood, the shadows twisted one final time, signaling the inevitable. The next move would not be anticipated. The central spire trembled, though no quake of the physical kind disturbed its obsidian bones. The Terran moved through its vaulted halls as though she commanded the very laws of existence. Walls twisted subtly, bending light along impossible angles, and gravity shivered in hesitant ripples beneath her steps. Even time seemed reluctant to proceed, pausing for brief, imperceptible breaths around her presence. We, distant watchers observing from beyond the stars, felt the impossible, the bending of reality itself, the warping of perception, the subtle rewriting of cause and effect to align with her intent. Counselors gaped, frozen in disbelief as the palace, long a fortress of calculable order, bent to her will. Traps designed to ensnare, corridors engineered to disorient, and security arrays thought infallible dissolved into irrelevance. Every plan, every carefully laid stratagem disintegrated under the weight of an unanticipated truth. Arrogance, once the Empire's constant companion, crumbled into dust. The Terran steps were deliberate yet effortless. Each gesture, each tilt of her hand, each slight turn of her head acted as command, not to weapons, not to soldiers, but to forces older than the stars themselves. Legends whispered in Terran myth as Baba Yaga, the harbinger of mortal vengeance, took form before their eyes. But myth alone had never captured this immediacy, this tangible inevitability. Her presence was not a threat, it was certainty, a moving law against which the king and his council were powerless. The Empire, centuries in the making, faced obliteration, not by fleets or armies, but by the sheer force of one human's will. We recorded the horror and awe alike. Light bent, sound warped, and shadows twisted in obedience. It was not power alone that emanated from her, it was inevitability made flesh. The Grand Galactic King, once absolute, now recognized the futility of control, and in that trembling hall of impossible angles and bending reality, a final silence fell, a silence that whispered across the cosmos. Resistance was no longer an option. Corridors that had once hummed with predictable order erupted into controlled chaos. Every step, every breath of the palace now seemed governed by unseen currents that favored none but her. The Terran moved through the halls like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction, yet nothing was destroyed without purpose. Trained warriors, their blades gleaming with centuries of refinement, froze mid-strike. Their weapons, honed for precision and lethality, became impotent against a foe who anticipated motion before it existed. We, distant observers chronicling galactic histories, felt the singular anomaly. Humans, long underestimated, were demonstrating dominion over reality itself. Probabilities bent subtly to her will. Tactical assumptions crumbled as if struck by invisible hands. The king's defenses, grand and meticulously crafted, unraveled under the weight of inevitability. Every failed assault against her was transformed into spectacle. Each miscalculation a monument to human resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet ferocity of survival honed over millennia. Shadows twisted unnaturally along walls, forming shapes that obeyed her silent commands. Floors warped beneath weightless steps. Ceilings coiled like living sinew, bending, flexing, reshaping the corridors into instruments of her control. Even the architecture itself seemed to acknowledge her authority, responding to intention rather than design. The council, once absolute in influence and certainty, found themselves scrambling for strategies that did not exist. Each attempt to regain order only revealed the futility of resistance. Whispers of myth became palpable in the air. Baba Yaga, the harbinger of mortal inevitability, had taken form. The Terran was no diplomat, no negotiator. She was a living assertion that the galaxy's oldest assumptions about fragility, hierarchy, and control were obsolete. And as the palace writhed and recoiled in response to her every movement, the king's voice cut through the chaos. Trembling for the first time, seal the spire, "Do not let her reach the throne." But the corridors themselves seemed to conspire against him, bending impossibly, guiding her closer, signaling with certainty. The inevitable could not be stopped. The Grand Galactic King stood amid the shattered remnants of his pride, the obsidian pillars of the Hall of Thrones reflecting his once imposing form in fractured splinters. His ceremonial armor, polished to mirror perfection, now seemed fragile, almost laughable against the quiet inevitability of her presence. Centuries of conquest, fleets that had raised worlds, armies trained in perfection, all rendered irrelevant by a single human whose every gesture carried the weight of myth made manifest. We observed him, distant chroniclers of galactic history, as realization crept like ice through his veins. This was not defeat in the usual sense, not the loss of soldiers or territory. No, this was revelation. Humans, dismissed for eons as weak, unremarkable, and bounded by mortality, could alter the fate of empires. The Terran's gaze, calm, deliberate, unyielding, conveyed authority older than politics, older than the ambitions that had built kingdoms among stars. Every glance communicated a silent truth. Power was not granted by hierarchy. It was seized by those who understood the forces beyond comprehension. The council, assembled in trembling awe, could barely maintain cohesion. Generals, advisors, and envoys alike scrambled for solutions that did not exist. Fear interlaced with respect as they recognized that their calculations, their strategies, even their understanding of the galaxy itself were insufficient to confront what stood before them. The king's humiliation became their collective lesson. The rules were no longer theirs to dictate, and in that silence, thick and unbroken, the Terran shifted her stance with imperceptible grace. A human storm now stood at the center of the empire, unmoved by centuries of authority and arrogance. The king, chest-heaving, eyes wide with reluctant comprehension, understood that he had faced not a mere diplomat, but the embodiment of inevitability. From our observatories, we recorded the unthinkable, the fall of absolute control, the first undeniable proof that humans were not only exceptional, they were unstoppable. And as the hall trembled under the weight of realization, the Terran stepped closer, silent, deliberate, and entirely unconquerable, signaling that the Empire's reckoning had only just begun. The dust of shattered corridors slowly settled, drifting lazily like fragments of forgotten time. Silence claimed the palace, thick and suffocating, pressing against the ears of counselors and soldiers alike. Even the stars outside the vaulted spire seemed to dim, as if recognizing the magnitude of what had occurred within these walls. The Terran moved through the remnants of destruction, her steps measured, unhurried, each footfall resonating with an authority that seemed to emanate from some wellspring older than the galaxy itself. She was unscathed, yet profoundly changed. Her eyes, previously calm pools of determination, now carried the weight of inevitability, a quiet force that demanded reverence. The council members, still trembling in the wake of chaos, whispered among themselves. Terran legends, once considered myth, stories told in hushed tones across the stars, were no longer mere tales. They had become reality. Baba Yaga, harbinger of mortal inevitability, had walked these halls and the Empire had witnessed it. We, observers in distant orbits, chronicled every detail, the subtle bending of light around her form, the almost imperceptible shifts in gravity as she passed, the silence of blades that once threatened her. Humanity, previously dismissed as fragile, limited, mortal, had proven itself something far greater. Not merely resilient, not merely clever, but capable of bending the expectations of entire civilizations, of rewriting probability itself with intelligence and unrelenting precision. The palace, once the epitome of order, now bore testament to one truth. No empire, no matter how ancient or powerful, could stand against the deliberate force of a human who understood the unseen currents of destiny. Every shattered pillar, every scorched panel, every fractured reflection told the story of a species that had quietly waited, refined, and mastered its latent potential. Even the council's surviving members could not meet her gaze. Where once they had plotted and judged, they now saw only inevitability. Whispered conversations carried tones of awe and terror. She is beyond comprehension. This is not diplomacy, it is destiny. A single mortal has undone centuries of supremacy. And though none dared speak aloud, their hearts recognized a truth the galaxy had long ignored. Humans were no ordinary species. As she moved toward the central exit of the spire, her aura lingered in the air, a residual force that bent perception. The corridors seemed to remember her presence, shadows tilting, walls breathing, as if the very architecture paid homage. The council and court watched helplessly, knowing that every moment, every motion, every subtle gesture would ripple outward, altering alliances, strategies, and ambitions for decades to come. We, the distant watchers, marked a pivotal moment in galactic history. A species had stepped from the margins to the center of inevitability. And though the Terran departed quietly, without fanfare, her absence was louder than any army, her silence heavier than any decree, her legacy inscribed across the memory of every being who had witnessed her. The Empire had survived, but it was forever changed. The galaxy itself had been altered subtly, irrevocably, by the quiet, deliberate force of one human. And in the vast blackness beyond the spire, among stars and void alike, we could sense the echo of her passage, an inevitability that would ripple across centuries. Humanity had arrived, not with thunder, not with conquest, but with presence, precision, and an understanding that would define the age to come. From our distant vantage, we watched the Terran Diplomat depart the Xarthan Imperial Spire, her silhouette framed against the shattered grandeur of the hall, a solitary figure walking into eternity. Even across light years, we sensed the gravity of her presence lingering in the vacuum of space, bending perception, as if the stars themselves recognized her authority. The galaxy, long confident in the permanence of its hierarchies, now trembled in the silent wake of human ascendancy. Legends would be rewritten, histories reconsidered. Powers once absolute would be recalibrated. Alien empires whispered in fear and awe, recounting stories they had dismissed as myth. The name of a human, a mortal whose frame carried the weight of inevitability, spread through the corridors of influence like a contagion of dread and admiration. We observed species older than galaxies, beings whose lifespans spanned millennia, pause in silent recognition. They understood that the era had shifted. Humans were no longer a footnote in history. They were catalysts of destiny itself. The Terran left more than physical space in her wake. She carried inspiration, fear, and inevitability, each step leaving a subtle imprint upon the minds and hearts of those who observed. Her calm, deliberate movements had rewritten expectations, redefined assumptions, and shattered illusions of supremacy. Where once the galaxy had assumed control, now it sensed the quiet, inexorable force of a species that had long been underestimated. We, distant watchers chronicling this pivotal epoch, saw the subtle transformation unfold across worlds. Alliances shifted, councils quivered, and ambitions, once solid as the cores of planets, fractured under the revelation that humans were arbiters of change. Their influence spread silently like a gravitational tide, altering trajectories without violence, without decree, but with the certainty of inevitability. In the void between stars, the echo of her passage lingered. The galaxy bowed, not with noise or spectacle, but with subtle acknowledgement. Humanity had ascended quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. One human, unassuming yet unstoppable, had altered the trajectory of empires, reshaping civilizations through presence, intellect, and the latent power of myth made manifest. And as we observed the galaxy hold its collective breath, it became undeniable the age of humans had begun. Not with armies, not with conquest, but with inevitability, cunning, and an understanding of forces beyond comprehension. From this moment onward, no species could ignore them. The Terran had shown the universe that mortality was no limit, and the rise of humanity would ripple through eternity.